You can go ahead and grab a seat. My name is Conor. I'm the associate pastor here at Bridge Church. Excited to be hanging out with you and continuing this series. Pastor Todd and Michelle are on a well-earned vacation over the Thanksgiving weekend. If you follow them on social media, know that they're carb loading pre-fast in January, because that makes all the sense in the world. Eat as many donuts as you can now, because when you hit January, you're going carb and sugar-free. So just do your thing. Anybody else see that? No? Maybe it's not funny to you, but it's funny to me. You know, look at all these donuts. Oh, it's delicious. Thanks, man. I want to eat some too. Anyway, so I'm hanging out with you this morning, continuing this series we're calling Counterculture, with the tagline on the bottom of it, learning to walk it out from the Sermon on the Mount, taking a look at the most famous sermon that Jesus ever preached, and working it out. What does it look like to actually take the words of Jesus that he spoke, he thought were important enough to say out loud to a large gathering of people? How do we actually take that and then apply it to our lives and live accordingly? And so we've been kind of diving through a bunch of these different topics. Would encourage you to go back and listen to all the messages. But there's an important distinction made at the beginning of as this Sermon on the Mount is introduced in Scripture. It says that there was a large crowd gathered, and then Jesus addressed his disciples, right? And so in that opening, they're making a distinction between two different groupings of people. That there's a large group of people gathered, right? That there's a lot of people who showed up. Why? I don't know, maybe they wanted free lunch, because Jesus passes out fish and chips all the time, everywhere he goes. Just like, here, let me get you some food. You know what I mean? Like, he's just passing it out, and people were interested in free food, right? That's why we give free stuff away to visitors, because we assume that you want free coffee and things like that, right? And then there's maybe people that showed up because they thought maybe they were going to see somebody's arm grow back, or walk that had never walked before. They were going to see some sort of insane, crazy miracle. They just showed up because they wanted to spectate and experience whatever it was that Jesus was going to do. And maybe there were some people that were a little bit interested in what he had to say, but for whatever reason, a large crowd of people gathered to hear what Jesus had to say. But it says that the crowd was gathered, but Jesus addressed his disciples, right? He invited the crowd to listen, but I'm going to talk to you, a disciple. I'm going to talk to you, this small group of people who have dedicated their lives to following me, right? This is Jesus talking to disciples, and that's a word that's lost on us a little bit. We like to throw out the words Christian often in our culture. I'm a Christian, I'm not a Christian, evangelical Christian, you know, all the different, the full spectrum of Christianity in our country has lost the meaning of what it is to be a disciple. We wear it like a label that often doesn't have much depth in meaning in our lives, but if you were a disciple, it had significant meaning. It meant that you would dedicate your life, you would make a declaration about your dedication to follow a particular rabbi or teacher and become as like that individual as you could possibly become. Every rabbi, every teacher had disciples. They all had people who followed them, and it was kind of the mission of every parent to see their child become a disciple. That was maybe like the key to exiting poverty, to exiting whatever caste you were put into, because in that culture and society, if your dad was a carpenter, that meant you were a carpenter. If your dad, you know, whatever your dad did, whatever your family did, that's what you did. You didn't really have a lot of other options. The only real option was to say, hey, I'm going to go become a disciple. I'm going to learn to do what this teacher does. And so parents would use this phrasing, right? They would say, go and be covered in the dust of your master's feet, right? They would send their children to go and follow this teacher, and the idea for them was to follow so closely that the dust that was kicked up from their feet as they walked down the road would cover their body. It's kind of a gross word picture, right? But it's supposed to be indicative of how closely and how intently they were to follow their master, follow their teacher, to become as like him as possible. We lose that culturally, right? Because there's a lot of people that check the box of Christian because that's comfortable based on history or upbringing or whatever. It's just a comfortable box to check. To check the box of I'm a disciple, a dedicated, declared Christ follower, has a whole nother meaning. But Jesus is talking to them and inviting the crowd to listen. And so I want to do the same thing. If you're in the room today and you call yourself a Christian, I want you to hear what I have to say, not because I said it, but because Jesus said it. I'm just trying to explain and apply what he said, right? But I want you to listen from that perspective. If you say, I'm a Christian, Don't listen like someone who checks a box. Listen like someone who said, I am a declared and dedicated Christ follower. I want to be as like Jesus as I can possibly be. And if you're in the room and you're like, hey, I'm just part of the crowd, somebody invited me to get a free donut, you know what I mean? Maybe take me out to lunch afterwards. They said, hey, just come and come to church with me one time. You never have to go again if you don't like it. You know what I mean? Whatever it was, they convinced you to come into this place. You're like, you're agnostic or you're an atheist, or you came into the room and you said, man, you know what? I just don't even think I'm good enough for this religion thing. Like, I understand that there is some sort of measurement system out there and that I don't measure up, and I don't know that I ever will, and so I'm just going to stay on the outside because I don't think I could ever be on the inside. I'm asking you to listen in for a second, because last week, Pastor Todd walked through, you can judge a tree by its fruit, right? Jesus says that we can make some determination about the core of a human being based on their actions. We can begin to discern what the most important, most valuable things are inside of them. We can look at the fruit, and the fruit tells the truth of what's the root. That internally, we can make some determination about where people land. What we cannot do is we cannot make eternal judgment based on where someone can stand. And the problem with what Jesus said, the immediate outcome of that oftentimes in our lives, and Pastor Todd addressed this, is we can become so fascinated with the fruit that we begin to pretend to be better than we actually are. We begin to create an appearance of fruitfulness. We begin to create an appearance of being religious. Jesus, in the very next few verses, breaks that down, right? And he addresses something that for many of us is one of our biggest issues with Christianity, even those of us that call ourselves Christ followers, but also for people out there in the world. One of the biggest reasons, I don't know if you've ever talked to anybody or seen any surveys done, but one of the number one reasons why people reject Christianity and keep themselves at arm's length is hypocrisy. They see hypocrisy within us because we claim to believe one thing and we exit a building and we live a different way, right? And so Jesus begins to address that. He also, in these 3 verses, which it sounds like a lot to address in 3 verses, but he does it. It's amazing, right? In those 3 verses, he also addresses leveraging religion for personal gain. Does that drive anybody else crazy? Like, if I hear another Christian or another politician say that they're a Christian so they can get an evangelical vote, I'm going to pull my hair out. You know what I'm saying? Like, no, just let your life tell us that you're a Christian. Just live your life in such a way that we can't even draw any other conclusion but that you're a Christian. Like, this is the type of stuff that drives us as Christ followers crazy. It also pushes the world away from Jesus. Because when they look at us and they see hypocrisy, or they see religion leveraged for personal gain, so I can maintain some sort of social status or entrance into some kind of club or make sure that some people like me. They just go, man, all that stuff is so fake. Why would I want it anyway? And so they push it away. And maybe you're in that seat today. Man, that's where I sit. I don't even want anything to do with it because it's all a bunch of nonsense because you guys don't live it out. It's just not real. So Jesus dives in on this. He says you can judge a tree by its fruit, and then he immediately follows it up with the 3 verses we're going to break down today. But before we dive in, I want to help make sure that we connect where this is flowing from. And to do that, I'm going to tell you a story that makes me look like an idiot because it's like a prerequisite to me doing a sermon on Sundays, right? Anybody that's been here for a while, you know this is true. And this is the beautiful thing about it. I asked my wife, I go, hey, babe, like, I want to tell X story on Sunday to help illustrate my message. And these are her only 2 clarifying questions. She goes, number 1, is it going to make me look stupid? To which I go, no, because I'm not that dumb. Like, I'm dumb, but I'm not that dumb. Right? No, the answer is no. I will not make you look dumb. And the second question she asked, she goes, will you make you look dumb? And I go, yes. And she goes, okay. You know, that's it. That's all that's required to get approval for sharing these stories. So this literally happened this week, and just to help you frame it up, like, if you don't know my wife, she's super sweet and compassionate and kind. Not only, like, she's a stay-at-home mom, but to put that into a frame of reference, like, she does all of our, like, cooking, cleaning, laundry. She does all the shopping. Like, I don't even see these things happen. I just know that when it's time to put on a fresh pair of underwear, it's in the drawer, right? Or, like, I'm hungry and I open the little cabinet door and there's food there, and it's like amazing. It just appears. I don't know how I got there. Little elves. I'm not sure, right? There's just this food there, right? My kids stay alive somehow, right? It's like miraculous that they're living, and I don't really totally understand how it happens every day, but they're still here, so that's good. She does all these things. On top of that, my wife also works 10 hours a week from home on the computer doing this medical thing that I don't really understand, but she does it. I see her do that. But the problem for me, and I don't know if you ever have this or experience this in your life, is that sometimes I don't really value what she does because I don't see it happening. Anybody? Right? I don't witness it happening, so therefore it did not actually happen in my brain, right? Like I just didn't see it. And so sometimes I get really nitpicky about little things that she doesn't do, right? Because I don't think about all the things she does do. And so that happened this week on like either Monday or Tuesday. I can't really remember. But it was one of those 2 days. I walk into the bathroom, and Mary's in there. She's getting herself ready for the day. And I walk in. I'm about to brush my teeth or do whatever. And at the end of the counter next to the toilet, there's a roll of toilet paper on top of the counter. And so I walk over, and I look down, and the little roller thing, I don't know what the right word is for it, but, little spring-loaded dealio, that's empty. And so I do what any rational human being would do. I take my 2 fingers, I stick it in the toilet roll, I roll it up, and I go, babe, 90% of the way there? Oh, yeah, I did. Yeah, I did. It was real dumb. I was like 90%. You couldn't go the last 10%. Like you couldn't just take the thing and pop it off and stick it on there. That's all you had was the 90%. It doesn't stop there. So she looks at me and she goes, it'd be really great if just sometime you could say something nice about all the things that I do. Now this is the deal. I've developed an antenna for when I'm in trouble. And I haven't really figured out exactly what to do with it, but the only thing I know to do is to get really quiet because I go into self-preservation mode. Like, don't say anything else out loud. You're only going to make it worse. Just shut up, right? Like, that's the only thing that goes through my mind. Self-preservation, I'm in trouble. I just get really, really quiet and just sit there and stare at it and go, oh, okay. And this is the problem. And I hope that maybe this helps you identify something within yourself. I hope I'm not the only one that does this. But I'm confronted with my shortcoming as a husband in lifting my wife up, making her feel strong and confident, empowered and valued. And my immediate response to that confrontation is not like, babe, you're right. You're amazing. Well, look at all the things that you do. You're incredible. The first thought that flows through my mind is, why don't you say something nice to me? Like, why don't you point out all the cool stuff that I do? Like, don't you see X, Y, and Z thing that I did? And why aren't you just going, hey, babe, you're awesome? Like, why aren't you saying that kind of stuff to me? Because my immediate mode in almost every area of my life is self-justification. When I'm confronted with my own shortcoming and how I failed, I do not immediately humble myself and go, man, you know what? I'm wrong and I'm out of line and I'm sorry about that. My immediate thought goes to, let's examine. I know that this is kind of a bad thing. I should have done this better, but let me show you all the ways that I'm right. And let me justify myself, which that self-justification is maybe the single most offensive thing to the gospel that exists within a human being, is the inability to recognize or the unwillingness to recognize my desperate, overwhelming need for grace. Because until I recognize the gap between how good I am and how good He is, I will never receive this incredible gift that Jesus died to give me. I just won't do it. And maybe you're in here and you're like, well, I'm not a Christian, so I'm not that worried about it. But you do this, right? Right? You look in your job and you go, man, you know what? I'm so good about X, Y, and Z thing, so I can bend this rule. I can manipulate things to work in my favor, and I know it's kind of wrong. But let's just look at all the hours I put in and the way that I do the right thing and X, Y, and Z deal. Or maybe you look at it and go, man, you know what? The way that I make all these positive decisions, I make all these good choices for myself, I've earned a night free of responsibility to go do whatever it is that I want. And when we do that, we're beginning to justify this thing that is out of balance inside of us, and we actually disconnect ourselves from the gospel. And what Jesus addresses in these 3 verses is our tendency to do that. And I want you to see it, and I want you to experience it. And if you're here today and you call yourself a Christ follower, my only thing is this: I just want you to evaluate yourself. Do you justify yourself? Or do you throw yourself at the feet of a Savior who's already justified you? And if you're in here and you think you're unworthy of the gospel, I want you to think about this phrase and think about this statement until you just can't deny it anymore. But it's not about how good you are, it's about how good he is. Because oftentimes we disqualify ourselves from receiving the goodness of the gospel because we think it's about us and our ability to manufacture righteousness, and that's just not it. And I'm going to show it to you in these 3 verses. Let's dive in. Matthew 7, verses 21 through 23. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Jesus out of the gate is making a distinction that there are people who are good at lip service, people who are good at making a claim about their faith and their belief, but do not actually follow through, and he resets the measurement of it, right? He says it's not about saying, Lord, Lord, right? It's not about making the claim, the statement, the phrase, I'm a Christian. It's about the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. And Jesus illustrates what he means by doing the will of the Father in another passage of Scripture. In Matthew chapter 21, verses 28 through 32, he tells a story to some Pharisees to illustrate this point to them. In another location, he says, listen, there's a father, and he has 2 sons. One son, he comes to him and he says, hey, I need you to go do this thing. And the son says, no, I'm not interested. But then he goes off and he actually does it. The second son, he says, hey, I need you to go do this thing. And the son says, yes, but then takes off and doesn't do it. And he looks at the Pharisees and he says, which one of these did the will of their father? They said, well, the first one who said no, but then went and did it anyway. And then he looks at these guys who have mastered the art of appearing to be religious, appearing to be more righteous than they really are, and put all the weight of this measurement of goodness in themselves. He looks at me and he says, listen, prostitutes and tax collectors are going to enter the kingdom of heaven before you. Because they might think that they're unqualified, or they might think that they're not interested on the outset, but they're going to come to this realization about how good their Father is, and they're going to go and execute his will. They're going to go and live it out. Meanwhile, some of us think that we're really religious and justified in and of ourselves, and so we give the lip service of saying yes, but in reality, we do not respond to the leading of the Holy Spirit in our lives. Because I can promise you this, if you are a Christ follower, the Holy Spirit is speaking to you on a regular basis, daily, about what it is that the Father wants you to do, how he wants you to live, decisions he wants you to make. He is showing up in all sorts of moments all over the place, and his measurement of whether or not you're executing his will is how you respond. Not with lip service, but actually walking it out and doing it what it is that God is leading you to do. Verse 22, he says, on that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many mighty works in your name? He's saying there are people who have lip service but will not enter the kingdom of heaven, and confronted with their own shortcoming because they were good at lip service, their response is to point to themselves. Wait a minute. Look at how religious I am. Look at how much I attend church. Look at how I give in the offering. Don't you see how I leverage my gifts and my opportunities in your name to bring you glory? Aren't you looking at all the things that I've done? Aren't you taking into account how good I am? This is a problem for us, and it's a problem for me. I make it about how good I am instead of how good he is. I look at my life and I get confronted with my own sin and my own shortcoming, and my immediate justification is, yeah, I know I'm messing that thing up, but let's look at how good I am in all these other areas. And I begin to justify my shortcoming in and of myself, and I miss the gospel of grace, right? Because any gospel, listen to me, anybody who makes the gospel, if they make it hinge on how good we are, that is not a good gospel. That's not good news, because every single one of us falls short of the glory of God. And in Ephesians 2, in verses 8 and 9, it says this, for by grace you have been saved through faith. That word faith means like a transition in an internal belief, a deeply held conviction. Specifically applied in Scripture, it means a shift in where you believe your relationship with God flows from. Like, what is it that actually earns you this relationship? And many of us have grown up in a system, we've come by it honestly, let's be real. Many of us have come by our system of measuring our goodness honestly. Because how have you been evaluated since you were a little kid? Whether or not you did it, whether or not you finished it, the grade you got on a report card. Now as adults, you're measured by the size of your paycheck, the number of people that report to you in a downstream at a company or organization, the size of the budget that you control within your organization. Every single measurement system we use outside of the gospel flows from whether or not you're doing these things, right? Did you do them? Did you not do them? And you get evaluated based on that. And so we come by this evaluation system honestly, but he says that it's through faith only. That is where our salvation flows from this shift in belief where we say, it's not really about me, but it's about him. That he has given me this grace and this goodness that has now brought me into salvation. And this is not your own doing. It is the gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast. And I thought that word result is really important because faith comes and works follow. Sometimes when we use verses like this, people like to point out in James that it says faith without works is dead. And really what James is getting at is that if this faith doesn't actually transition internally to that deeply held conviction space where I understand that I'm only saved because of the goodness of God in this gift of grace, it will not result in authentic action and an authentic shift in the way that I live my life. It's not the result of doing good things. Good things are the result of my faith. Right? It doesn't make good things bad, right? I've never met a homeless person that an atheist walked up to and said, hey, I want to give you $100. And they went, no, I'm sorry, you're not doing it for the glory of Jesus Christ. You know what I mean? Like, I've never seen that happen before because good works are still good works. They're still valuable. They still might improve someone's life. But disconnected from the gospel, unmotivated by this understanding that ultimately it's about the goodness of who God is and the message of the gospel being communicated into the lives of other people, it's now just a temporary earthly action, and the value is lost the moment that person dies. Connected to the gospel, it has a potential to transform someone's eternity. You understand the difference? Good works are still good works. Connected to the gospel makes them eternally valuable. But that's the problem, is a lot of times we view it as my salvation flows from my works, and we know that because a lot of times that's the way we evaluate it. When we try to prove somebody that we're a Christian, we just point to the things that we do, our own actions. Don't you see all the good things that I do, all the good things in my life? But it's not about how good I am. It's about how good he is. And then in verse 23 he says, and then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. They're using two different measurement systems, and Jesus makes that incredibly clear. Look at all the things that I did. I don't know you. Look at all the things that I did. I don't know you. That is the separation. Our salvation flows from Christ and Christ alone, not because of how good we are, but because of how good he is. The works are an outflow of the gospel's work in our life. And this is the deal. I'm not saying that we give our lives to Jesus and then we can be as irresponsible as we want to be because we know him. No. What I'm saying is that I believe that that grace creates room for growth. That grace creates room for growth. That when grace enters my life, I feel a weight lifted off of my shoulders from this need to perform and prove something. And I'm so in love with the goodness of God and the work of grace in my life that works flow naturally, right? My motivations shift and change. It becomes less about, let me prove something to you about who I am, and more about, let me show you who he is. You begin to walk through life going, man, I don't care if anybody ever knows my name, if they know how good God is. I want them to see the gospel's work in my life. I want them to see how good God has been to me, how he's transformed and changed me, not so I can get any glory or credit or praise, but so that more people would know about the goodness of the God who saved me, who covered my sin, who didn't wait for me to make myself righteous, but became righteousness for me and took my sin to a cross. My life shifts when I understand the goodness of God given to me on the cross of Jesus Christ, and my motivation changes, and that is what changes my life. When I make a decision, when I make a declaration that I'm going to be a Christ follower, I'm not signing up for a new moral code by which to live. I'm making a declaration about the submission of my life to the lordship of Jesus Christ, and in grace asking him to have his way in me and through me, because I know I'm going to fall short. I know I'm not going to measure up. And this is the crazy thing. I'm about to read you another parable that Jesus told in Luke. I'm going to read you this parable, and a lot of times, all of us that call ourselves Christ followers like to view ourselves through the lens in this particular story of the tax collector. What I'm going to ask you to do is, if you call yourself a Christ follower, to look at yourself through the lens of the Pharisee, right? Examine yourself for a moment and just be honest with me. Because this week, as I was getting ready for this message, I was working on it on Friday evening, wrapping up and getting to the end of the message time. And if I'm honest with you, I'm not a very emotional person. My wife sometimes tells me I'm like a robot, and she wishes I would respond emotionally to some things. And she's like, you don't have any reaction to that at all. And I'm like, I literally have no feelings. I don't know what you're talking about right now. You're literally asking me for something I don't even know. I'm just lost, right? But I'm sitting there, and I'm working on the end of this message, and that song, Be Lifted Up, came on, and I just began to cry. Not wipe a tear away, I couldn't talk, or I couldn't say things out loud, I couldn't do anything else. I just began to bawl, thinking about myself and how often I justify myself and how wrong that is and how much it minimizes the work of Jesus on the cross when I try to make a big deal out of how good I am. But then I also began to think about all the people who call themselves Christians who are actually completely missing the gospel because they don't recognize how desperately they need grace, because we collectively justify ourselves. We make it about how good we are instead of how good He is. And this is how you know the difference. When you get confronted with your sin, what's your immediate response? Do you point to how good you are, or do you throw yourself at the feet of a God who's so good? He says, I love you exactly as you are. I'm going to give you grace and allow you to grow. Your life's going to transform and change, not because of what you did, but because of what I do. It's my work in you that's going to transform and change you. Where do you land in that? And I'm going to ask you to evaluate yourself from that perspective. And if you're in the room and you're not a Christ follower, I want to ask you to view yourself through the lens of that tax collector, because I also started to cry about all the people that I can think of in my life that I talk to that think that their sin and their shortcoming prevents them from receiving the gospel message. The reality of it is that it's your sin and your shortcoming that qualifies you as one who needs it. And I've heard this argument made before when talking to people, and people ask questions. Sometimes when you talk to people about faith, they're throwing out questions not because they're interested in an answer, but they're just trying to ask some philosophical thing that really can't be reconciled, and it's just kind of annoying, to be honest. But if you feel it necessary to ask these questions that are unanswerable, party on, man, whatever, do your thing. But they'll say things like, well, if God can do anything, can God create a rock so big that He can't move it? Anybody ever heard that question before? Either way you answer that question, you now put a limitation on God's creative ability and His strength and His power, so it's an unanswerable question. It's just nonsense. But when we say things like, if you knew me, if you knew what I've done, if you knew where I've been, if you knew how I treated people and how messed up I am, you'd know that I am not good enough. What you're saying is that you as a created being are able to create a rock so big that God can't move it. And that is a flawed theology. What you're saying is that your sin and your shortcoming is a bigger deal than Jesus choosing to go to the cross for you. You're minimizing. I appreciate that. But the point is that you're minimizing the work of Jesus Christ on the cross. You're saying it's not big enough, it's not grand enough, He's not good enough to pay for your sin. And that scares me, that there are people who are prime candidates for receiving the gospel would keep it at arm's distance because they don't know that it can cover their sin. I'm telling you today that it can, and I'm going to read this story, and I want you to find yourself in it, and I want you to be honest in your response. That if you feel compelled to respond, I want you to respond. If you're a Christ follower, respond by humbling yourself and say, man, God, I recognize how far short I fall, and I need your mercy, and I need your grace. It's the only way, it's the only thing that qualifies me. And if you're here today and you're like, I'm outside this thing, I want you to see yourself in it, and I want you to do the same thing and just kind of go, man, God, I know I've disqualified myself. I've made a big deal out of my own sin, but I'm throwing myself at your feet. I need your mercy. I need your grace. In Luke 18, verses 9 through 14, it says this. Then Jesus told this story to some who had great confidence in their own righteousness and scorned everyone else. 2 men went to the temple to pray. One was a Pharisee, the other was a despised tax collector. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed this prayer: I thank you, God, that I am not like other people. Cheaters, sinners, adulterers. I'm certainly not like that tax collector. I fast twice a week, and I give you 1/10 of my income. But the tax collector stood at a distance and dared not even lift his eyes to heaven as he prayed. Instead, he beat his chest in sorrow, saying, "O God, be merciful to me, for I am a sinner." I tell you, this sinner, not the Pharisee, returned home justified before God. You cannot receive grace without recognizing your desperate need for it. You cannot experience the fullness of the gospel while you're making a big deal out of who you are. Like those two things are at war with one another. For me to make a big deal out of how good I am and at the same time try to make a big deal out of who God is, how good God is. I want to echo with my life the words of John the Baptist: I must decrease and he must increase. It's not about me, it's about him. Like legitimately, I would tell you this: if you walk out of here today, it would be a gift to me if you would forget who I am, because you're so overwhelmed with how good God is. Because you're like going, man, God's so good. God's been so good to me. Even in my arrogance, in my religious approach, he still pours out mercy and grace into my life. In my attempts to self-justify, he still pours out mercy and grace. And no matter how far I run and no matter what I've done, he's still pouring out mercy and still pouring out grace. I am literally never too far away from God to respond to the gospel and be reconciled to him through Jesus Christ. I'm going to ask you guys to stand with me this morning. Part of our response this morning is going to be going back into that song. And I'm excited about singing that with you. If you understand the goodness of God, I'm going to ask you just to sing that with every ounce of energy in your body, that you'd walk out of this place with that song ringing in your ears, just thinking about, man, this is who God is and how good he is, be lifted up in my life. But today, if you call yourself a Christian, but you find yourself justifying yourself, I want to give you an opportunity to respond. I'm just going to ask everybody to close your eyes for a second as we do that today. Go ahead and close your eyes. If you would say today, man, you know what? I find that in me. I have found that I've taken a lot of comfort in my religion, in my ability to be good, that I put a lot of weight into showing the world how good I am, how good my decisions are. And when I'm confronted with my sin, my first step, more often than not, is to point to how good I am and all the good decisions that I make and all the good things that I do. Would you just be honest this morning and just slip your hand up in the air and say, man, you know what, that's me? And I'm going to ask you to pray for me. My hand is up with you. Thank you for being honest all over the room. Thank you. I see you guys here on the left, my left, your right. I see you guys in the center here. Thank you for being honest. Thanks for being honest over here and in the back, on the sides, man. Thank you for being honest and transparent. I think that's just an incredible step. You guys can go ahead and slip your hands down. If you're here today and you are not a Christ follower, and this whole time in your whole life, you've always felt like you were disqualified from even becoming a Christ follower because of how short you fall, because of how big your mess is, because of all the things that you've done, would you respond to the gospel this morning, understanding it's not about how good you are, it's about how good he is, and he's already died on the cross to give you a gift. All you have to do is receive it. Would you say, man, you know what, today, I want to step into a relationship. I want to be known by Jesus. Would you just slip your hand up in the air and say, that's me? I know that I need Jesus today.